Welcome to the latest episode of After Aston I. And today we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Daniel Franklin, Aston alumnus and executive editor of The Economist. Geoff, what can you tell us about Daniel?
Well, I can tell you that Daniel graduated from Aston in 1981, having completed his PhD in Soviet foreign trade. He's currently the executive editor, as you said, at The Economist, which was founded in 1843 by a Scottish hat manufacturer to further the cause of free trade. Since then, The Economist Group has evolved into a global media brand, expanding its journalism online through an app, podcasts, films, interactive infographics, and social media. Daniel joined The Economist in 1983 to write about Soviet and East European affairs, and since then has covered a vast number of topics, including the collapse of communism, the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, the first term of US President Bill Clinton. His roles have included Washington bureau chief, editorial director of The Economist Intelligence Unit, editor-in-chief of Economist.com, business affairs editor, and more. In addition, Daniel has published two books, Megatech, Technology in 2050, and Mega Change, The World in 2050, books on long-term trends. Daniel, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you and back associated with Aston.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel. So as we've just outlined, you've had an absolutely jam-packed career at The Economist, reporting on some of the world's biggest events. What have been some of your favourite stories or events that you've covered over that time?
Well, I think the emphasis is time. I mean, it's been 41 years, so it's an awfully long period. But I think, the highlights for me are those moments when you feel you're seeing history in the making. So certainly when communism was collapsing in Eastern Europe, that was the most extraordinary thing. Didn't think I'd see that in my lifetime, and I felt I had a front row seat for that. So that was extraordinary. Anytime you get to be a foreign correspondent, it's enormous privilege, particularly, I think, in America. So my time in Washington, actually two spells in Washington, stand out for me. And I think the thing that actually you didn't mention in your resume there was, for 17 years, I got to edit The Economist annual look at the year ahead. So it was called The World In, and whatever the next year was. Now it's called The World Ahead. But that was a fantastic opportunity as well, to get out the crystal ball every year and see what's coming up.
Do you often look back over some of those predictions and surprise yourself with prescience or slap a hand to the forehead and think, how did we miss that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's often said that it's a very dangerous thing to forecast, especially about the future predictions, But every year in that edition, I would write a sort of mea culpa of what we got wrong and right, but the fun bits were what we got wrong. And the one that stands out for me, I think it was the world in 2008 when we were looking, or 2009 maybe, when we were looking back at the global economic crisis. And I think I headlined it about 2008, sorry. So that gives you a sense. But actually, readers always like it when you fess up, and that's, people appreciate that you're sticking your neck out for that sort of thing.
Brilliant. You've covered the most recent US election, which was obviously quite an interesting global event, has continuing impact on the world around us. What can you tell us about that experience being part of the 2024 election in the US?
Well, of course, it turned out to be an absolutely fascinating election. It was, for the first part of it, I would say, not terribly exciting, because there weren't really interesting primaries to speak of. That was all over very quickly, and it was very obvious what was going to happen. But then from the moment, I think, of that famous or infamous debate when Joe Biden bombed so badly and it became clear that he just wasn't a viable candidate this time, things became extraordinary, unprecedented. You had the assassination attempt on President Trump, Joe Biden being, in effect, pressed to stand down, and then the very quick emergence of Kamala Harris, turning it suddenly into a competitive race again. And it was very competitive. You look in hindsight and Trump's victory was quite clear, but it was still down to the wire at the end, or everything, all the swing states moved in the same direction, but it was not a foregone conclusion. So that was a completely fascinating thing to follow. And of course, an important thing to follow, because as we see now, the implications are so big, the impact on the world is so big, it matters. And the sense of being at the heart of operation, trying to explain what's going on, trying to explain what matters, what it all means, that's a great privilege.
With, as you say, 41 years of looking at the world and being sometimes up close and sometimes at a distance, do you feel that at the minute we're living in particularly interesting times, to coin a phrase, or do you think that's a natural thing that everybody always thinks in their present time?
Oh, no, I think these are definitely interesting times with all the Chinese connotations that brings. Extraordinary times. I mean, we're seeing, I talked about the collapse of communism. That was a very visible end of an epoch. And now I think we're seeing the post-war order that has been around for the whole of my lifetime, longer than my lifetime, since 1945, being challenged to a remarkable extent with great uncertainty about what it all means and how it will shake out. At the same time, I think you have, and I've been talking politics, but that's not the only thing going on. You're seeing technological change of a remarkable nature, extraordinary fast. I mean, there's already been the most astonishing technological change in my time as a journalist. When I began, believe it or not, we were still working on physical typewriters and literally hard copy and red pens and so on. Now it's a whole new world, and artificial intelligence is speeding things up and bringing other great uncertainties to every sphere of life, I think. So yes, interesting times is perhaps an understatement.
I wondered, Geoff, you had some thoughts around AI that perhaps it might be useful to pick up on here. So did you want to jump in with some questions on that front, and then we'll come back to kind of Daniel's history?
So with AI, I'm fascinated. As a non-technical person or non-technological person, I'm very much one of those people who, once everything's working and someone shows me how to do it, I'll do it. But I don't have a clue as to how it works. But I do know there's a lot of talk at the moment about these large language models and how they're being trained and how they're using pre-existing materials without necessarily having gathered potentially permissions to do so, and interesting questions about copyright. Does that affect journalism as well? Is that something that in the world of journalism is a great concern, as well as in, say, fiction? Or...
Yeah, I think it's both a concern but also an opportunity. There's very sort of two sides of the coin, I think, in journalism. So from where I sit, you see all sorts of media organizations having to decide to what extent they make their databases available to AIs to explore and to produce services. We have kind of dedicated teams working on various projects, pilot projects, or some of them have actually started to be used by our readers and our viewers. So you can see it. You can see both its potential for producing new kinds of journalism, and you can see its potential for, of course, a tool for producing the traditional kinds of journalism. So it's tremendously efficient for gathering your notes together and making sense of them, or producing charts, making sense of data. We, the Economist, have been using it for translation, interestingly. So suddenly, there are these dangers, as you say, but there are also potential to reach whole new audiences that would have been impossible to reach or impossibly expensive to reach, because translation historically has been a very expensive thing. But we can now provide at least a basic level of some of our content to audiences in Japanese or Mandarin or French and German really almost immediately.
And do you think it's one of those kind of, people tend to look at these things in quite a binary sense of it's either the best thing since sliced bread or it's going to be a disaster, whereas often change ends up being a bit of both?
I think that's absolutely right. I think you're completely correct in that. I think it's very disruptive. That's, I think, what we can say for sure. And if you just ignore it and wish it all goes away, you're probably it's not going to end very happily. But some of the ways of looking at it, I think, are this repeat mistake that is often made when new technologies show up, which is that it's going to replace us all. There's going to be no room for humans in the process. And even with AI, which I think is, has such extraordinary capacities, I suspect that shows a lack of imagination, that actually what does happen in the real world is that you create new things that you couldn't do before, and humans are still needed to do that. And you can repeat, endless number of spheres of employment now, which simply didn't exist before, but exist because of technological change, which at the time was very disruptive. So if you're a drone operator or a computer programmer or indeed an AI kid, those roles didn't exist before. They're going to be big employers for the future. And you only have to look at the companies that have extraordinary valuations in the stock market to see how that happens.
The genie's out of the bottle.
Yes, I think so. Well, it doesn't mean you don't try and control it in some ways. I think that it is an enormously powerful genie, put it that way, and you don't know whether the genie is going to be always a good but occasionally it will definitely be a bad genie.
Can I go back to the beginning? So you've completed your PhD. Did you have a journalistic career in mind, or did you drift into it as many people do? Or did the career come looking for you with what you'd actually been researching?
No, I definitely didn't have a journalistic career beforehand. And the first thing I did, by the way, was to travel around the world. I finished my thesis and I spent a year traveling around the world. And I came back. Aston's always been very good at finding jobs for its graduates, particularly because most of them have had some sort of work experience. Same was true with me. Mine was a sort of sandwich course for the first part of it anyway, that involved some time spent with a branch of Dunlop. Obviously, the Birmingham connection is clear. And I was surprised when I came back from traveling around the world that the world wasn't bending over backwards to hire me. So I applied for all sorts of things, and eventually I found a freelance role very much linked to my academic research, writing a freelance report for the Economist intelligence unit. And that was my way into the Economist. And once I had contacts there, I was very fortunate to ask whether there might be a role after a while, after I'd written my report, at the newspaper itself. And I have to say that the time that I walked in for the interview that I then had with senior editors at The Economist was the first time that I'd felt, of all the other interviews I'd done, that I'd come home. This felt me. I felt comfortable. I felt this was, and for the first time, the people who were interviewing me didn't think it was a bit odd that I'd travel around the world. They thought it was the most natural thing in the world, because curiosity about the world was the heart of what we do. So I never looked back. I was very lucky to be there at the right time. And it turned out that the stuff that I did at Aston actually helped me get my job.
Amazing. We always love to hear when Aston turns into something career related. I'm just thinking, so my background's in public relations, and I think this question probably is quite a silly question, knowing how many of the journalists I've worked with have experienced their days. But is there such a thing as a typical day in your life, or is it different every day?
Well, there are certain routines, I would say, just to give it some structure. And I should preface this by saying, as you kindly pointed out at the beginning, I've done lots of different roles. So the days have looked different depending on the role. But in the production of The Economist, as you correctly pointed out, we now do all sorts of media. We still produce the weekly printed edition of what we call the newspaper, but we're producing news daily, we're producing social media, podcasts, films, and so on. And we do conferences. So that it can be very varied, but there's still in all that the routine that comes from the weekly edition of The Economist. And it still remains quite important to us because we come together on a Monday morning as a group of journalists to discuss the menu for the week, to debate the leader articles that we are proposing to write. And those meetings are extraordinary and very precious things. You have all these very, very bright colleagues talking about the world, what we should focus on and what we should say about it. And then we have another meeting on a Friday to briefly review what's gone on and start looking ahead to the following week as well. So those are the broad sort of bookends of it, if you like. And then on a Wednesday, which is our weekly press day, it's very busy for me in my current role, just editing the copy, getting it through into the final stage. But because of all these new media, at any stage, if news breaks, you can be called upon to leap onto a story, whether writing it or editing it. And there are all these, as I say, podcasts and social media posts to check and so on. It can get very intense. It's become really a 7-day-a-week role. And unfortunately, you have colleagues who stand in at various stages of that process. But it's compared with when I started, it's a much more fluid and constant operation.
And do you think with all the technological changes, and we've touched on AI as well, that there is a future for journalism? And what does that future look like? How does the world need to change to adapt to technology?
I do believe there's a future, but it's not necessarily an easy one for media organizations to figure out. I mean, you obviously have to go where people's attention is. And nowadays, increasingly, people's attention is on a screen of one sort or another. In future, maybe that screen will transmit itself to you in a different way, who knows? But that's where you have to be if you want to have an audience, if you want your reporting and hopefully your insights to be consumed. So I think the future is increasingly in making yourself approachable, easily consumable on the platforms where people are reading the news or hopefully going for the news, assuming people still go for the news. And that means you have to adapt what you do to, well, all the obvious social platforms, and make sure you aim to do it with the same kind of editorial values that you've traditionally had in print.
With the prevalence of citizen journalism, digital channels, and so on, we're also seeing much more disinformation and misinformation out there. And I wondered how you, as an editor, but also as the Economist, were tackling that change in society.
Well, it's a big thing. You're quite right. And I think part of, if we have a place in all this, part of it is as a trusted brand that people will turn to amid a sea of information that they may trust less. So I think that creates an opportunity for journalism that is well reported, well fact-checked, well written, but that's not going to do away with a lot of misinformation. There's also a role, I think, I actually chair a charity that's connected to it was born out of The Economist, called the Economist Educational Foundation, which encourages the development of news literacy and provides materials for young people to engage with the news and try to distinguish what is real and fake. And so there's an educational part to this as well.
I'll have to follow up with you on that, because we've just done a media literacy session for our undergraduate students, helping them to understand how to triangulate sources and not just to believe the first thing that they've read on the internet. So it's definitely something that is quite fascinating right now. Geoff, I'll hand back to you for some more questions.
You mentioned editorial standards and social media, and Aimee was asking about disinformation. There appears, again, and this might be one of those things where is it just in the moment, but there appears to be a greater degree of polarization happening as well. And you mentioned, say, being a trusted brand, steering a course through that. What's the difference, I suppose, between objective and neutral?
Yeah, well, if you talk about polarization, the place that it's happening, I think, everywhere, but nowhere more so than in the United States. So reporting on an American election of completely polarized electorate is an interesting experience, a challenge. But again, I think it's something that is a bit of an opportunity for us as semi-outsiders, but informed outsiders to America. We're a British publication, although we have a lot of very brilliant Americans on our staff, but we have a degree of distance, or we can able to keep a degree of distance, which I think is helpful to that. And again, comes back to the question of trust. If you can be trusted by both sides of this polarized country, then you're doing something right, or accused by each of being hopelessly biased to the other side, which also happens. It doesn't stop The Economist in particular saying what it thinks. So I mentioned we debate our leader lines. So we have strong opinionated leader lines, but That's different from the reporting that is hopefully based on as much factual information as an independence. We're not beholden to any owner who has an agenda of left or right or whatever. We keep a firm objectivity and independence, but that doesn't stop you voicing opinions. And as you said, we were founded in 1843 to champion for free trade, and that's still a cause for the Economist. And as you might have spotted in the news, it's still a relevant one. So our roots still matter, I suppose.
And with some of the access you've had over the years and some of the kind of the things you've seen up close or talked about off the record as well as on the record with individuals, and I'm not sure this is going to be a quick or an easy question to answer, but what are some of the biggest misunderstandings or misapprehensions that a layperson might have about how political systems or economic systems work in reality?
That's not an easy one, because you're trying to think what people, on the whole, I think people are fairly smart and they do have a sense of how systems work. But perhaps, the privileged position you have as a journalist is you get to meet people who are actually making decisions or setting strategies. And you realize it is a very human process in the end. These are not impersonal systems. So the human dimension is one thing. And then I think the mistake more broadly that people looking at the world often make is to think that it's immutable in ways that turn out to be not correct. Things have a greater capacity to change than people realize. And that was certainly true in some of the episodes that I mentioned, the collapse of communism, when suddenly it takes everybody by surprise. Clearly something's been going on beneath the surface that was more powerful than people realized. And I think it's been true again in the recent years of politics. It was true in spades for the global economic crisis, when people didn't see clearly enough the risks and the instability that was happening beneath what seemed to be quite a calm financial system until it wasn't. So, and I don't necessarily by any means exclude journalists, and certainly not myself, from making that mistake too. But our job is partly to try to be mindful, I suppose, of those changes that might not be instantly apparent on the surface.
And we're talking about change there, and you've written a couple of books around future trends, around kind of where the world might be going. So I'm curious, what do you see as the most significant political, economic, social, technological trend shaping the world right now?
We've talked about AI and technology, so it's not just AI, of course. I think there are huge trends in the life sciences, and to some extent AI is an enabler of rapid developments in other spaces as well. So probably said enough about that. I'm always fascinated by demographic trends, actually. They move more slowly, but they're hugely significant. And if you take the longer term view and you looked at those worlds to looking ahead to 2020, you see huge shifts in where people are in the world, the age profiles of countries, the size of their workforce, all those things. And slowly, as they evolve, they help explain the sorts of phenomena that we see happening around us today. So the aging of China, for example, the rise of India with a younger, more dynamic population that's now bigger than China's, the aging of Europe, the rise of Africa with all that the challenges that represents for making sure there are jobs and economy for millions of young workers, the potential impact on migration. So suddenly the trends that we observe in the world around us become very real. Clearly, the environmental aspects of what we're doing to our planet are pretty fundamental as well. Again, they can seem to be slow moving, but they seem to be speeding up. And we find ourselves reporting on the consequences of that constantly, whether you look at what's just happened to Los Angeles, rich world, great city, second biggest in America, and facing enormous challenges now for reconstruction. And that's just one example. So I think that there are sort of 4 or 5 mega trends: technology, certainly climate change and the environment, demography, and I would add to that political and cultural shifts, which are probably sort of fairly obvious to today, but of course they matter hugely, and if you trace them, they've been happening for some time. They don't suddenly arrive in a vacuum.
And I'm curious, you've talked about kind of 4 decades of reporting on those shifts in the world. How has the dialogue changed around some of those mega trends that you're discussing? So, for example, the environment, from CSR to ESG to what comes next. How is that dialogue shifting in a media space?
Well, the dialogue, partly as you're just mentioning those acronyms, it acquires a kind of jargon, which is a little bit dangerous because that kind of slightly desensitizes you too easily to what's going on. And it also, when it becomes popular, it can generate a backlash or counter reaction. So I think that's part of the interest now, and the task for people trying to make sense of what's going on is to judge, well, if there is a backlash, was it all nonsense in the first place, or is it going to remain with us just in different forms, and will there be a backlash to the backlash? So I think that's a dynamic that plays itself out. That's politics in a sense, and it never stops. It's a constant dynamic that is part of what we have to try to make sense of.
Fantastic. And you've talked about some of the countries that perhaps are seeing demographic and workplace changes at the moment. But I wonder, are there any industries that you think are particularly poised for either growth or disruption over the next decade?
Well, I suppose, sadly, the defence industry is poised for growth because that's the way the world is, a more dangerous world. There's going to be arms build up, and so more spending on defence. That seems to be pretty much, the question is how much, not whether, I think, at this point. I mentioned the life sciences, an extraordinary, exciting time of invention, I think, for that area. And, the speed at which, with the help of new technologies such as gene editing and the attachment of that to AI tools, means that it's going to be a great period of invention. Despite everything else, I think renewable energies are the way that, tremendous growth, even in America, as it happens, even in a state like Texas, which you associate with the traditional oil and gas industry, it's also very, very strong in renewables. And I'm sure I'm missing out all sorts of industries that have great potential, but those are some of the ones that spring to mind.
Daniel, it's been absolutely fascinating going deeper into the last 40 years and your view on that. But we do have a couple of more whimsical questions that we always fire at every single guest to wrap things up. So, first one, if you could have anyone in the world, dead or alive, working on your team, who would it be?
Well, I think I'm very lucky to have a wonderful team that I work with at The Economist at the moment. So those are the ones I'm most familiar with. And there is one person who has various times been my editor or just a colleague, who is just an extraordinary person, who's our obituaries editor these days. Name is Anne Rowe, and she is week in, week out writing the most extraordinary portraits. We only get to pick one a week, so the selection is interesting, but capturing these lives is a phenomenon. So I would nominate Anne.
You wouldn't trade her for anyone?
Nope.
Fantastic. And I'm going to take you back to Aston now. We started off talking about some of your Aston experiences, but I wonder what your favourite Aston memory is from the time you spent here.
Well, I think it's actually a surprising thing, perhaps, that soon after I got to Aston to do this research, it very quickly became apparent that Aston didn't actually have the expertise that I needed for my research. So it didn't get off to a very good start in that way, because I think they'd lumped me. The work that I was doing was with a company that made firefighting equipment, part of Dunlop, and they lumped me in put me in a kind of health and safety bucket. Whereas what I really needed was not health and safety, but expertise on the Soviet Union and the Soviet trading system. So it so happened that there was a very remarkable expert in that field at Birmingham University who was, I'm happy to say, interested in my work. Phil Hanson was his name. And to eternal credit of Aston, and to my great gratitude, they managed to make him a visiting member of the academic staff at Aston so that he could help supervise my research. And I think that was life-changing for me, because as anybody who's ever done PhD knows, having a good supervisor makes all the difference, and someone you really respect. And so that was, I think, great credit to Aston that they were flexible in that way to make that happen. That's probably a much longer memory than you wanted, but it's a meaningful one to me.
No, and I'm really pleased to hear that you were able to get that experience. Universities are often positioned as being in competition with each other, but at the end of the day, we want the best possible research to come out of the process. So the fact that you were able to get that expertise and that team built around you to make that happen is a fantastic memory, and thank you for sharing that.
Now, Daniel, that's some of your oldest memories of Aston, but I know you've got some more recent ones, and you've had a lot more engagement with us in recent years, haven't you?
Yeah, thanks for that. I have been engaged with the medical school and been supporting an essay prize for the second year students there, which is now, I think it's entering its 5th year. It's been fantastic. It's been named after my aunt, who was Rosalind Franklin, who was involved in the discovery of DNA with Crick and Watson and others. And the idea is that because it's a new medical school, it would be good to give the students opportunity both to think about more broadly about their medical studies and to get a first prize and a runner-up. That would be something that would be on their resumes for the rest of their lives, something they could be proud of. And it's worked really well. The quality of the essays has been fantastic.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We've run out of time, which I don't believe, and I do believe all at once, because there is so much that we could have covered today. We've learnt a lot, and it's been fantastic to chat to you. So thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Aimee. Thank you.
And listeners, we would love to let you know about Aston Online. You can study both undergraduate and postgraduate degrees with us, fully online from the comfort of your own home. Programs include our Master and Doctor of Business Administration, MBA and DBA, as well as MS Cybersecurity, a Master's in Management, and more. If you are interested in taking the next step in your career with an Aston Online program, be sure to check out the link in the show notes for all of the details. That's it for now. We'll be back soon.